Hello and welcome to Comcare's information session on understanding your 2024-25 premium. I'm Sarah Donoghue, Acting Senior Director of Comcare's Claims Management Group, and I'll be your host for today's event. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are virtually meeting today. I am joining you from Melbourne, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I would like to pay my respect to their elders past and present and acknowledge the contribution they have made and continue to make. I also extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islander people who are present. Before we begin, I'll go through a little housekeeping. This session is being recorded. However, only myself, the presenters, and the slides will be captured in the recording. This recording will be made available on our website in the coming week. You will notice your microphone and camera are not able to be turned on. The chat function is enabled, and we encourage you to participate in the conversation via the chat, which will not be included as part of the recording. As always, we ask that you keep it respectful and on topic. If you are using the Microsoft Teams app, there are instructions on the screen now on how to turn off chat notifications during this session, which you may otherwise find distracting. I'll also point out now to please stay till the end of this session so we can share a link to the feedback survey. It will be emailed to you, but you may find it easier to do it within the session. I'd really like to thank you for making the time to come along to today's information session. Feedback from last year's premium webinar, Comcare's employer survey, and general feedback has certainly helped to shape this session. Joining me today is Ash Evans, Principal from Taylor Fry, Comcare's Independent Actuary, Mick Duke, General Manager, Scheme Management Group, and Lockie Vivian Taylor, General Manager of Claims Management Group at Comcare. This session will focus on liability and the premium pool, a presentation from Taylor Fry, key steps in the premium process and addressing drivers of premiums, early intervention and return to work, presented by Mick Duke, key observations, trends and initiatives in claims, presented by Lockie Vivian Taylor, and finally we'll have time to answer some of the questions that you asked us in the registration to this session. I'd like to start by giving some context to what you will hear today. Claims for psychological diseases are a large share of the claim portfolio and a key cost driver. Looking now at mechanisms of psychological injury, work-related harassment and/or workplace bullying and work pressure have been the most prevalent causes of psychological claims. Psychological claims continue to have poorer return to work outcomes than injury and disease claims. In terms of the big picture, 174 agencies will pay a premium this year. Currently, there are about 1,900 employees and ex-employees in receipt of incapacity benefits. In 2022-23, accepted incapacity weeks for the scheme added up to about 1,650 people off work for the entire year. This is a large impact on productivity across the APS. This would be enough to fully staff a number of medium-sized APS agencies. Just let that sink in for a moment, as we are not just talking about financial costs here, as all of these all come with an individual impact, an impact to your organisation, but also to the broader community and our national capacity. I'll now hand over to Ash Evans, Principal at Taylor Fry, Comcare's Independent Actuary. Ash will speak about liability and the premium pool. Welcome, Ash.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here again. Excuse me while I find the button to take control. I don't have it, so I'll just be noting when to skip the slide, if that's all right. Sarah, thank you, Sarah. All right, as mentioned, I'm the scheme's independent actuary. I have been so for some years, and Taylor Fry have been served in this capacity for quite some years now. It's fair to say we know the SRC Act and the relative levers that affect premium and liability very, very well. We've seen the ups and downs over time, and when we bring that when we make our assessments of premiums and outstanding claims liability. Today I'll be talking about a few items. I'm going to zoom in on the premiums. You're all premium payers. That's why you're here today. So I'm going to talk about how we've been setting it, how it's tracking, what are the risks that we see, and also some of the opportunities we see there. We will touch briefly on the liability. They're two sides of the same coins, premium and liability. One affects the other and vice versa. If we jump to the next slide, please. The premiums that we're recommending, our central estimate of the premium rate has jumped in for 24-25. So you can see on this chart to the left-hand side, we have the premium rates there. They've actually remained fairly stable over the 5 years to 23-24, and you can see in that context, a pretty material jump as a percentage of wages for 24-25 of 9% up to 0.95% of wages for that year of estimated wages, I will say. And we'll be talking a little bit about what causes this, but Sarah has already introduced one of the main drivers in psychological disease claims. But I thought it would actually be helpful to look at this in context on the right-hand side against other states and other jurisdictions where we can see that the scheme rate of 0.95 compared to the most recent publicly available rates or break-even rates for most of the other jurisdictions here in Australia and down the bottom there in New Zealand. And we can see at 0.95, the Comcare scheme is relatively affordable from a workers' compensation perspective. There's some, there's an asterisk with this comparison. For starters, the workforce is very different to Comcare than the broader schemes that are below it in that chart. But at the same time, the SRC Act is very different than other schemes and comparatively what an actuary would call longer tail, which is people tend to stay on benefits longer, or the legislation at least provides for people to remain on benefits for longer under the SRC Act than in all the other jurisdictions mentioned here. So that means that the comparison is not necessarily like for like, but in terms of affordability, in terms of percentage of wages, Comcare, despite that 9% increase, remains relatively affordable compared to other jurisdictions. If we jump to the next slide and look at the premiums and what contributes to this 0.95 and in the previous years, what we've done here is got the exact same columns. So these are adding up to the same amounts we saw on the previous chart, but my team has split it in three: injury and physical disease, psychological disease, and effectively everything else in the premium. So other payment types, claims administration expense, whatnot. And you can see some really clear patterns here in our pricing of workers' compensation for Comcare. Firstly, injury and physical disease has been on a long march down that actually predated the graph here, predated 2019-20, where it's making up not just a lower proportion of premium, it's also just making up less overall. So where for injury and physical disease in 1920, we recommended 0.29% of wages would be needed to cover the claim costs associated with injury and physical disease. That's now down a third. So it's now at 0.19% of wages necessary to cover these types of cost. On the other hand, we see the march upwards of psychological disease. And the growth in the premium is due to this marching up, particularly in the last year, quite quickly. So while in 1920, 0.32% of wages was dedicated to costs related to psychological diseases, that's increased by 50% up to 2024-25. So now 0.048% of wages we projected to cover the cost of psychological disease. So this is our outworking. This is our central estimates and our recommendations regarding the premium pool. It is worthwhile having a quick look at what drives that result. And the biggest driver of that result we show on the next slide, which is simply the number of claims coming in. So when we think about premium, there's a few, and liability, there's three main drivers that we care about. We care about how many claims are there, how long are they on benefits for, and how much are they receiving each payment. What's their compensation each quarter, if you like, or each fortnight. They're the three main drivers of premium and of liability. And the one that we're seeing movement in is, more than anything at the moment, is the number of claims, and specifically the number of psychological disease claims. And I think this chart shown here demonstrates this really clearly. The growth in the number of psychological disease claims accepted in the scheme. This is matched particularly very recently by the number of claims received in the scheme for psychological disease. So you can see for 2016, 17, 18, 19, the number of psychological disease claims that we observed year on year, despite, I would say, an increasing wage, an increasing number of FTEs, was around that 200 to 215, 216 level. But what you can see since 2020 is a gradual increasing trend in the number of psychological disease claims accepted. This puts upward pressure on the premium, and significant upward pressure, because psychological disease claims do cost more on average than injury and physical disease claims, materially more. The other thing that's impacting this year's premium that is unusual, that's not necessarily looking back at the experience like we're doing on the left-hand side here, but looking forward, is the passing of the Closing the Loopholes Act late last year. And specific to this act, the presumptive coverage for PTSD for first responders and other eligible employees. This has an impact. It has been implemented for first responders in other jurisdictions, and we have observed the impact of that. We've applied it here to Comcare, and we estimate that will increase the premium pool, and we've allowed it to increase the premium pool in the vicinity of 9.2 million. What's worth pointing out about this prospective change for the 2024-25 premium is that it affects only specific agencies that have exposure to that have first responders. So those agencies being the Australian Federal Police primarily, Air Services Australia in some degree, and the Department of Home Affairs via Border Force. These are all covered under the Act, now have presumptive PTSD provisions in place, so that additional premium is shared exclusively between those agencies. So that's the big driver of premium rates. Often in this type of circumstance, I'll go through a list of drivers, but really this is the one to focus on. Everything else has been moving roughly in line with how we've seen historically, and has been unremarkable. And I believe last year we even talked about this being a risk. It is now a risk that is manifesting itself in the premium. The other thing I'd like to note, which I do on the next slide, in headwinds and volatility, is just the economic conditions. They do have an impact on premium. As I said, we term the Comcare scheme a very long tail scheme in that we are accounting for benefits that are paid 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years into the future and pulling them back. In that type of timeline, that makes the premium very sensitive to things like inflation and investment returns, and very specifically the prevailing interest rates, the risk-free interest rate or government bonds. And because of that sensitivity, the premium can move up and down because of changes in projected inflation and projected, or the market's view of projected interest rates or future interest rates. It's very sensitive to these assumptions, so it's worth pointing out here purely because those features, inflation and interest rates, have been quite volatile in the last couple of years. That has led to some volatility in the estimates of liability and premium that in previous years wasn't observed. This is something we keep a close check on. It's not actually something that Comcare has any control over. As premium payers, there's not a lot of control over these, but they do influence the premium up and down. I guess some premium payers do have some control over over interest rates and whatnot, but by and large, for this purpose, these are external factors impacting the premium that we just have to live with as a very long-term forecast in the scheme. Luckily, inflation and interest rates do move in tandem with one another, which gives them an offsetting effect. And as I mentioned earlier, the other side to the coin is liability, which I look at on the next slide. Liabilities are the other side, as I said, of the same coin. Liabilities and premium go hand in hand. They have identical drivers. If you like, the premium is the cost of a claim incurred tomorrow. The liability is the outstanding cost of the claim incurred yesterday. And we advise Comcare, and Comcare hold assets via their funding, and that's what's expressed in the funding ratios, hold assets such that any claim that has previously been incurred, there's enough money set aside to care for that individual and deal with that claimant all the way up until they no longer need to receive any benefits. You can see there's been a slight increase here, a $53 million increase, but this has been quite stable. And you see it hasn't had the same sort of distinct increase that the premiums have, and that's simply because the liability itself is not as sensitive to claim increases in claim numbers as the premium is, because the claims have already occurred. So this one hasn't increased by as much. It is still relevant. It's still $53 million. Is not no money. It's still a material movement, but less dramatic in a percentage sense than the premium. As I mentioned, it is the number of psychological disease claims that are driving our premium pool result this year. While this is the outstanding claims liability is less responsive to the number of claims, it is very responsive to return to work rates, and they have actually been pretty stable over the last 6 years, and that's why it hasn't changed so much. Return to work rates, though, it is worth saying that return to work rates are no less important for the premium pool than they are for the liability. They just have been stable. But the reason for pointing that out is because on the next slide, I thought it was a nice story to end with. So separate to our usual work is we helped Comcare, in partnership with Monash University, Taylor Fry independently evaluated a pilot program that, if I'm being honest, had fairly remarkable return to work outcomes. We were very pleasantly surprised, albeit on quite a small sample. But the Your Future pilot that Comcare ran over the last couple of years, which involved brokerage and coaching, fairly intensive care, did see some reasonably long-term claimants return to work at a rate that was 250% higher than we expected to observe for that population were they not intervened upon in this way. Now, this is a really strong result. We don't expect necessarily there's a number of things that can be happening here, but even if this result was halved or more than halved on rollout or on broader application, it would be a material impact on the liability and on premiums, and it goes to show that return to work and improved return to work can have a positive impact and has the potential to materially reduce the liability and materially reduce the premium pool and the premium paid by premium payers. So as I said, I can't, I'm an actuary, so a wet blanket by profession. So there's a lot of asterisks when you do something on a small group of people, extrapolating it to a large population. But early results were so positive, I felt like it was worth pulling it out here as an example of how good return to work is feasible and would have an impact on the premium. Something like this would have a material impact on the premium if we saw it more broadly in the population. So while the pilot was a success story, I'll probably leave us on that success story and hand over to Mick to discuss his section. Thanks, Mick.
Thanks, Ash. You're selling yourself short. You're not a wet blanket at all, mate. It's good to see so many people here today. As mentioned before, my name's Mick Duke. I'm the General Manager of Scheme Management as well as the Deputy CEO at Comcare, and the premium function in Comcare sits within my group. I would like today to speak to you about a couple of the key steps in the premium process, as well as focusing on those key drivers of premium that Ash has briefly touched on before. But specifically give you a bit of information about the importance of early intervention and return to work, as well as some of the trends we are seeing. In order to do that, though, I might just start again with a bit of a bigger picture and contextualization of the premiums. You just heard from Ash briefly touch on the nature of our scheme and the way in which entitlements are crafted. Comcare is a long tail scheme, and it's one of the last long tail schemes in the country. What does that mean? Essentially, what that means is that we're a scheme that's geared around payments of benefits, etc., for the life of an injury and the life that for as long as that injury is impacting an employee. So what does that mean? That means that incapacity payments can continue for decades out until retirement age. At the moment, that's 67. And other payments like medical payments can exist for the lifetime of an individual. So in that context, you get a pretty quick sense of the key drivers of cost within our scheme. The biggest driver of cost is time off work, or what we would call incapacity payments. So as a result of that, the key focus for us and for premium payers really needs to be around injury prevention to stop a claim emerging, and return to work. So if an injury occurs, focusing on getting people back to health, returning them to work, because that performance on prevention and return to work is critical to scheme costs. Excuse me. If I turn now to what we're seeing in 24-25 premium, and you're probably all aware we've already commenced the process of sending out the indicative premiums for 24-25. So what does it look like as a whole? Ash has touched on this a little bit, but Comcare measures premium paid as a percentage of an entity's payroll. As a result of some of those upward pressures that Ash spoke about, and indeed Sarah introduced at the start, we are seeing the 24-25 average premium rising up from 0.84% of payroll to 0.92% of payroll. The 0.92% is different to Ash's because that doesn't include the impact of the presumptive PTSD legislation. As Ash mentioned, if you include that, it goes up to 0.95. So all premium paying entities are going to be affected by this change. And the increase is due to a number of factors. And Ash has touched on some of these, but we are definitely seeing an increase due to the psychological disease claims. There is an increase in higher projected claims administration expenses. There's a multitude of factors underlying that, but at the heart of that is something that's pretty simple. Psychological claims are more complex and require more effort to manage effectively, and ergo that requires greater administration on those claims. It's not all bad news. Those increases are being partially offset by the continued reduction of injury and physical disease claims. That rate of 0.92 or 0.95, both of those still exist in a space where Comcare meets our general target of keeping the premiums at 1% of payroll or below. It's important to probably note that 0.95 obviously is not applied to all agencies. There's only 3 affected agencies related to that PTSD presumption. Ash also mentioned before about how that sits comparatively to the rest of the country. The rest of the workers' comp jurisdictions are facing similar upward pressures around economic conditions, but equally around psychological claims. So Comcare's premium has still recorded a reduction in premium of about 18% over the past 5 years, and it does remain the lowest premium across Australian jurisdictions and New Zealand, as per currently reported. Average premiums, look, over the last decade and until recently, the average premium, as I mentioned, that we have been charging has been trending down, and you'll hopefully see that on a slide now. This is obviously a very pleasing trend, and it's been driven primarily by a decline in injury and physical disease claims. However, if you look across that same decade, the incidence of psychological claims, which is the yellow line on the chart, these have steadily increased, particularly over the most recent years. This is very important impact on the premium because psychological claims have poorer return to work outcomes than injury and physical disease, as people tend to stay on benefits for longer. If we move now to the next slide, it just presents this information in a slightly different way. And the differences between physical injury and disease claims versus psychological is more evident when you look at it in this slide. The chart shows those claims that are remaining on incapacity benefits by injury types. And here, what you can really see is that steady decline in injury and physical claims on incapacity benefits over the past decade, while psychological disease claims have tended to remain on incapacity. And this has in fact been trending up for a time since 2019. So it's quite stark. This is not just new claims. This is the representation of claimants who have stayed on incapacity. One of the things we're also probably looking at is that there seems to be a little bit of a plateauing on that physical disease and injury profile as well. And that's something we're obviously continuing to watch. If I turn now to the mechanics of the premium, something that I'm sure you're all interested in, 24-25 premium, what does it cover? So I mentioned before about the long tail nature of claims means that our premium forecast also includes the estimate of future inflation on payments and investment returns. And as Ash has mentioned, that can be quite volatile. The calculated premium is set to fully fund the forecast lifetime cost of claims arising out of injuries and disease sustained during 24-25. So it's forward thinking. It's thinking about what claims will occur in 24-25 and how much money will we need to collect in order to pay those claims for however long they might require payment for. That also includes the claims management costs, as I mentioned. So the types of costs that we are typically paying out are for time off work, for medical and rehabilitation expenses. There's also a factor of lump sum payments, which go to people who might suffer from permanent impairment injuries or tragically involve death. It also covers any payments related to legal services. So the disputation element of claims is also covered through the premium. So the lifetime costs of 24-25 injuries and diseases will continue to emerge over the decades. It's probably worth mentioning here that there are many schemes across the country that have come into difficulty due to insufficient funding. Indeed, many have actually had to tweak their legislation or get extra money from government. This is something that Comcare takes pretty seriously, so we do have quite a rigorous approach in order to ensure that we remain fully funded, and it's something we take very seriously. And that's, in essence, how we come to the decisions we make around premium. If I turn now to the key elements of premium calculation, and there'll be elements of this that are quite technical. We'll start with the premium calculation and the premium window. So the premium calculations uses accepted claims with a date of injury in the last 4 financial years. So for this round, we're looking at 2019-20 to 2022-2023. This is what we call our premium window. Within that premium window, we look at the lifetime costs of these claims, and they are then divided by an entity's payroll. The lifetime costs are calculated as payments that have already been made on those claims, plus the estimates of future payments. In order to do that estimate, Comcare uses a robust statistical case estimate model to calculate what those estimates for each claim are, and those case estimates reflect the characteristics of that claim. So it looks at things like the injury type and any emerging pattern of benefits paid on that claim. So obviously, if a claim, when we set a premium, has returned to work, that will be reflected in the case estimates. Just to touch on our case estimate model, it was recently updated in 2021, and that update has proven to be more reflective of historical claim outcomes. The real benefit is that it uses more up-to-date data on claims, and this ensures that it's responsive to any changes in circumstances on individual claims. So what makes up the premium calculation? Comcare calculates the premium of your entity as a sum of 2 main components. The prescribed amount, which is your entity's share of the premium pool, in essence, the slice of the pie for each financial year. It's calculated by multiplying your entity's prescribed rate by your entity's estimated payroll for that financial year. The prescribed rate is equal to the prior year's prescribed rate multiplied by the pool trend, so what's happening in the pool overall, as well as a performance adjusted, which relates to your claim experience. The other component on top of the prescribed rate is the bonus and penalty amount. And this is an adjustment to your entity's contribution to the last year's premium pool. And it's based on an additional year of claims data. So we have more up-to-date information about claim performance, and that's then reflected in the bonus and penalty amount. I'll come to this in a minute. This is where really the effectiveness of your organisation's injury management support can make a real difference. In getting under the hood a little bit of some of this stuff, I'll just start with the pool trend factor. So let's consider the trends in claims experience across the overall insured scheme. This is basic feature of a pooled insurance experience. If the final premium pool as a percentage of an insured scheme payroll has decreased since the prior year, then the pool trend will be less than 100%. This would tend to decrease an entity's premium if all things were equal. Conversely to that, if the final premium pool has increased, the pool trend will be greater than 100%. And this will tend to increase an entity's premium if all things were equal. So the pool trend factor looks at reflecting changes in the scheme's claim performance since the previous year's premium pool was set as a percentage of payroll. And this is based on the forecasts that are provided to us by our actuaries, which is Taylor Fry. It's important to note that the same pool trend factor applies to all insured entities. So the calculation of the pool trend for 24-25, as has been mentioned, we are seeing an increase here in the pool. So that will have an adverse impact on premiums. So as you'll see on the current slide, we're looking at 0.92% for the 24-25 year, divided by that 0.84% of last year, gets us to 108.9%. So as you can see, this calculation excludes that PTSD amount, but as we're above 100, we are seeing upward pressure on the premiums. Looking at the performance adjustment element now, one thing to note about the performance adjustment calculation is that it balances the need for premiums to respond to changes in performance, but also providing stability. So we don't want to see premiums jumping up and down wildly from year to year. So this performance adjustment helps us stabilise and minimise that unnecessary volatility from year to year. The performance adjustment does reflect changes in your entity's incurred cost rate relative to the rest of the scheme since last year. The incurred cost rate is in essence the estimated lifetime costs of claims divided by payroll, and it is used to measure claims performance in respect of those claims that are reported and accepted only those claims that impact across the premium window, which includes injuries in the last 4 complete financial years, as I mentioned before, 2019 to 2023. And it accounts for the lifetime costs of claims. Again, that's how we use our statistical case estimate model in order to anticipate the future likely cost of claims within that premium window. If I look now to a little bit of a conversation about what might drive a performance adjustment and what might increase or decrease that performance adjustment. The key elements here are the premium window has moved forward 1 year from last year. So what we are seeing is the oldest year is dropped off in terms of our calculations and a new year has come on. So if an older year was high cost and the newer year was lower costs, then you could reasonably anticipate that the performance adjustment would go down. Conversely, if a low-cost year dropped off and a high-cost year came on, then you would anticipate some upward pressure. The performance adjusted is also affected by the claims experience, so changes in the existing claims and how they're performing. So you might have had a claim where it was medical-only payments, but that employee may have now needed to go off work for a period of time and started incapacity payments. That will get reflected in changes in the performance adjustments. The other 2 elements are similar and probably reasonably easy to understand. Processing backlogs, so we might, in the premium window, an employee might have submitted a claim for several years of incapacity that we didn't know about when we set the premium the last time. So that might include back payment or reimbursement for old medical costs. We might also see a late accepted claim, e.g. for an older injury that might have been originally declined and then gone through a process of reconsideration and acceptance at the AAT. Or at a federal court process. So again, these were all things that might be the key drivers to changes in the performance adjustment. The next key element relates to the bonus and penalty. The bonus and penalty revises, as I mentioned before, the prior incurred cost rate with an extra year of claims data. Each entity's share of last year's premium pool is adjusted each year by changes in your entity's incurred cost rate. This is relative, again, to the scheme overall and since last year, as reflected in the performance adjustment. The difference between the revised and the initial prior year's prescribed rate is multiplied by the prior year's estimated payroll to determine the bonus and penalty amount. Why do we do this? We do this mainly because it achieves a fairer allocation of last year's premium pool between the entities by reflecting any of the changes that might have occurred in claims circumstances or such as late receipt of claims. Many of you are probably aware that in previous years we have applied a discount to the pool, and that has been a result of a really strong funding position. Equally, when we've had issues around our funding ratio, we've been required to load amounts onto the premiums. This year there'll be no pool discount or loading. Our funding ratio sits at probably a reasonably good range for us at around 116 to 117%. So there will be no discount or loading applied to the 24-25 premiums. I will quickly touch now on what can you do to affect your agency's premium. While most injured employees have less than 1 week off from work, the few who do remain on benefits for longer than a year account for the majority of claim costs in our scheme. So to reduce premium rates, your entity must be looking at ways to reduce the number of claims by preventing workplace injury, but also supporting employees to stay in good work. Reducing the cost of claims, such as payments for time off work, makes up the largest component of claims costs. So again, efforts in returning people to work make a big difference in relation to premium. It's a key reason why Ash showed that case study before, which was a great example of the positive impact that returning people to work can have and how it can drive premium outcomes. So the best ways entities can reduce claims is to prevent injury, manage that early and a sustainable return to health and return to work of injured employees. I hope this has provided some insight into the processes Comcare uses to calculate premiums and the key drivers for your organisation. The team will, at the end, will have a premium inbox available. If you've got specific questions about your premium, you can feel free to reach out to the team. They'd be happy to answer those. I'd like now to thank you all for coming. It's an important topic for you to be aware of, but it's also equally important to hear about some of the key observations in our claims area, and hence why I'll throw now to Lockie.
Thanks, Mick, and Ash and Sarah, and yeah, great to be here. So. Yeah, my name's Lachlan Vivian Taylor. I'm the manager of the claims management group at Comcare. And look, what I'm going to go through, I am conscious of time. I'm going to go through key observations and trends from a claims perspective, and then talk and reiterate some of the things that have been talked about with regards to what we can do, both you as employers, but also from what we're doing in Comcare around initiatives to support better return to work outcomes and also subsequently have an impact on the premium. So firstly, just to touch on this slide around the claim profile and the claims that sit within the premium window. So the chart on the left shows that after consecutive decreases in the preceding years, over the COVID period particularly, the volume of claims being received is increasing. The chart on the right shows that despite increases in claims received, the initial acceptance rate remains stable, meaning we're seeing an increase in the total number of accepted claims, and this can be explained by the increase in claims received. Claims received volumes have shown an increase across all of the claims, but most notably with injury being 15%, psychological injuries around 22%, as you can see on the chart on the left. These increases do appear to be associated with a normalisation post-COVID, although this does remain to be seen and we need to continue to monitor this. We can see an increase in injury claims aligned to increased activity from return to the office environment, including injuries such as trips and falls. And these trends are continuing to increase across 2023, 24. As discussed previously, psychological claims remain the greatest contributor to claims received volumes, from 35% in 21-22 to 37% in 22-23 of the total claims received. And as of the 30th of April 2024, psychological claims now represent 42% of the total open claims, and again, the greatest proportion of total open claims. Looking at the data, it tells us that our prevention and early intervention strategies do have a stronger impact on reducing physical claims, as you can see with the lower rate of movement among these type of claims. So moving to the next slide. It's the importance of preventing psychological injuries and providing effective early intervention support is clearly highlighted when you look at the average lifetime claim costs. This is important because the cost of accepted claims on hand flows through to the premium pool, ultimately your premiums as employers within the scheme. And clearly, this slide shows starkly how much greater the average total liability cost per psychological claim is when compared to other injuries. Look, in the first year alone, psychological injury claims on average result in almost double the cost of injury and disease claims. As psychological claims are typically more complex, with more time off work and greater incapacity costs, which are the greater driver of claim costs, this gap continues to expand. Now to touch on the mechanism of injury. So look, to help focus prevention, early intervention and return to work efforts, so they more effectively manage the risk of psychological injury, it is important to understand the primary cause of the psychological injury. And look, this slide shows the top 3 mechanisms for psych injury in the premium window. So psychological claims represent 28% of claims within the premium window, fewer than that in the open pool due to the extended period of time between the injury and the lodgement. This results in fewer claims in the premium window parameters, although representing less than a third of the claims, psychological based claims represent 63% of all incapacity weeks paid. The increased incapacity weeks paid has a direct result on the total costs, which accounts for 62% of the total costs. You can see from the slide that work-related harassment and workplace bullying is the most common cause of psychological injury, followed by work pressure. And look, this highlights the importance of fostering a positive work culture and good work design. Together, these claims, harassment and bullying, represent 37% of the total costs within the premium window, primarily driven by incapacity. In terms of performance and your agency's ability to influence premium outcomes via return to work, it's important to understand the claims contributing to these high costs and look for opportunities to target these individual claims that will result in periods of incapacity by offering suitable and sustainable return to work when the employee obviously is healthy, that benefit both the employee and the agency. So now to touch on improving return to work. So how do we improve return to work for psychological injury? Look, firstly, I do want to acknowledge that preventing and managing psychological injury is complex and can be difficult. Achieving return to work takes a collaborative effort between all involved. So the employee, obviously, yourselves as employers, Comcare, rehabilitation providers, and all the other people that work with the client. From an injury, but particularly psychological injury, the single most important thing that you can do is to establish a really strong, supportive relationship with the employee to help them in their recovery and facilitate them getting back to work as soon as it is safe to do so. Now, this is because good work can promote further recovery from injury and illness, and recovery is critical to achieving a full return to work. It's important to note that contrary to common belief, employees with psychological conditions don't have to be 100% well to be at work. And as employers, you play a critical role in supporting recovery and return to work, and evidence shows that there are proven strategies that will improve return to work, including early action is critical early, regular supportive contact, responding positively, as well as access to early intervention programs that offer avenues to treatment and workplace supports. Reducing the concern associated with lodging a claim and avoiding unnecessary delays to claim lodgement. Help with identifying suitable duties. Engage workplace rehab providers that have the right skills and experience, particularly experience in managing psychological injuries. Comcare also has resources such as good work design toolkits to support your agency in both prevention and return to work initiatives. So look, in summary, preventing injury, particularly psychological injury, and providing effective early intervention and return to work support when they do occur will help improve return to work rates and subsequently have a positive impact on reducing premiums. So in terms of Comcare, look, our aim is to work closely and collaboratively with you to support positive outcomes on individual claim matters, and also to help you understand your agency's workers' compensation performance more strategically, the drivers and risks to help build capability to address them. So look, our account managers, they play a really important role in this. They support employers through the claim process, provide analysis, subject matter expertise in claims management strategies and practice, and can help all of you identify where further support can help improve claim outcomes and lift capability. Over the last 4 years or so, Comcare, we've really sharpened our focus on adopting evidence-based best practice when it comes to managing psychological claims and supporting employers to manage them. So look, what we've done is we have embedded injury managers within the claims teams. These are people with allied health qualifications, including psychological qualifications, and they work alongside claims managers to provide clinical expertise, diagnosis, treatment, prognosis, and also, most importantly, look at return to work strategies. We have increased psychology and psychiatry resources on our clinical panel, and again, they work very closely with our claims managers. We've also established a dedicated return to work support team that works closely with the claims teams, account managers, and also you as the agencies and employers to provide guidance on return to work cases, help employers identify improvement opportunities, and connecting them with resources and support to help build rehabilitation case manager and return to work capability and improve overall rehab and return to work performance. Look, both Ash and Mick mentioned the return to work pilot that we ran last year, and I thought I'd just take a bit of time just to talk a little bit more about that. The pilot offered an alternative approach to rehabilitation and return to work for employees when the return to work, the traditional return to work rehab approach hadn't worked. So employers who participated in the pilot were placed with a career coach and were offered job readiness coaching and an employment brokerage service to help find employment both within the APS but also outside the APS as well. The program had reasonably good uptake. We had 34 that completed the program. 85% of those participants had a psychological injury, and their average time since injury was about 4.1 years. So you can see there that the average, those clients, the traditional rehab service hadn't worked. So that was an important part of the pilot. Of the 34 people, 14 achieved an employment outcome, which meant that the return to work rate was 40%, which is much higher than the 20% expected for the same profile of clients. Participants also reported improvements in their experience of psychological distress, financial distress, and also general health as well. So due to the success of the pilot, we're now offering the program as a BAU service, and hopefully we continue to see these positive outcomes. Look, if you'd like to know more about this exciting program, please reach out to us, particularly through the account managers that you work with. We're also doing a lot of work to collaborate across the different states, territories, and the different jurisdictions to really understand what best practice and what are the innovative programs that sit across those states to drive increases in return to work outcomes. And within Comcare, within the claims management group, we've got a really strong focus on customer service. We know that if a client has a good experience through the compensation process, it could really help to drive those return to work outcomes. On top of these improvements and initiatives, we'll continue to look at what else we can do to improve health and return to work outcomes with a particular focus on psychological claims. So that's it from me. What I'll do now is I might hand back over to Sarah Donoghue to take us through to the next step.
Thanks, Lockie. And we do have some time now to answer some of the questions that we received during the registration process. But if we don't get to all of them, we will make sure that we collate our responses to those questions, and we can upload them onto our website along with the recording of this session. So the first question that we received through the registration process was, how would the last 4 years of incurred cost impact on the premium rate for each agency? And Mick, I think this is probably one that you might be able to answer for us.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's a really good question, one that I touched on a little bit in my presentation, but boiling it down to its basics, your agency's recent claim experience is one of the most important or key components in determining your agency's share of the final premium pool. So this is done through comparing your agency's claim experience in the 4-year window to the experience in the benchmark, i.e. the expected claim costs using your agency's prior prescribed rate. If your claim costs are higher than expected, then your agency's share of the total premium will increase. And so it's likely to place upward pressure on your premium. Obviously, the reverse applies. So if it's less, then it would put downward pressure on. Hopefully that answered that question, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Mick. And I've just looked at the next question. I think this might be suitable for you as well. Can claims be identified with variances for premiums? For example, difference between old and newer claims that affect premiums?
No, short answer. Perhaps I'll go into it a little bit more. Your agency's premium outcome really responds to the overall trend in your agency's claim experience across the 4 most recent complete injury years, so that premium window again, as well as to trends in claims performance across the overall insured scheme as well. So when you're looking at those factors, we're looking at trends within a 4-year period plus trends in the pool overall. So it's therefore really difficult to identify an individual's claim's exact impact on a premium. But what we do know from a trend perspective, reducing overall claim costs on individual claims is really the best way to reduce your premium. So, you know, while we can't sort of break it down into its individual parts, clearly the less claim costs, the better it will be for your premium.
Thanks very much, Mick. I'll just move on to another question. Can you provide a case study example of an organisation who has reduced their premium while their workforce actually increased? I'll take this one. So I think, as we explained at the start of the presentation, we're unable to provide specific examples for agency premiums. However, if you have questions about your premium, please speak to your account manager. And I think the next question aligns with that one as well. What do we do if we have queries about our premiums? You can contact your account manager in the first instance, or email your query directly to our premiums inbox, which you can find in your premium letter. A link is also included at the end of this presentation. All right, I think that's probably a wrap up in terms of the Q&A. And again, we will respond to any questions that we didn't get to in today's session. So that brings us to the end of our session today. We would greatly appreciate you taking the time to complete the short survey that we will email out to you. It is also available by scanning the QR code on screen, and there is a link in the chat. I also encourage you to stay up to date by subscribing to e-news and following Comcare on LinkedIn. That way you will be notified as we develop and release the latest research, resources, and upcoming events and engagement opportunities. Thanks very much for your attendance today. Stay safe and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.